CogX. Very happy to be joining you today. I want to talk about the geopolitics of AI. And I thought I was reminded of a question I had about a year ago. We're a few months into the war in Ukraine. And I was at the White House and asking what countries are doing the most to provide military support for Ukraine right now. And the answer I got was number one, the United States. Number two, the United Kingdom. Number three, Microsoft. Number four, Poland. I said, wait a second. Microsoft. Best I understand, that is not a NATO treaty signatory. It's not a country. Nobody voted for that leadership, but providing enormous importance. Indeed, we all talk about the war in Ukraine starting on February 24th, but actually the war started on the 23rd with massive cyber attacks by Russia against Ukraine that mostly hit cloud computing in Washington State. And Microsoft had been helping Ukraine develop robust cyber defense capabilities for years. That came to mind this week for me as I saw, and everyone in the audience did as well, that big flap about Elon Musk in the Walter Isaacson book that we're all talking about right now, the new bio where he looks like Steve Jobs and the whole thing. And there's a big question about whether or not Starlink was being made available to the Ukrainian military in being able to fight in Crimea, a part of Ukrainian territory that was illegally annexed by Russia, but that Elon was concerned if he allowed the Ukrainians to use Starlink, that could lead to World War III. So he said no. Now, I am not discussing this to be critical of Elon's decision or not. I recognize that actually President Zelensky might very well not be in power today were it not for the technological security tools provided by Microsoft and SpaceX and a host of other private sector companies that helped ensure that the Ukrainians could defend themselves. What I am suggesting is that the fact that those decisions are increasingly in the hands of a small number of individuals that run and own technology companies is new. And it's a game changer. I believe that Elon Musk has probably done more to support Ukrainian independence than almost any individual on the planet outside of Ukraine. I also think he's made decisions that haven't allowed them to engage in some attacks in illegally annexed territories. That's an enormous amount of individual power. And as much as that is critical for the fight over Ukraine, I also know that if mainland China were to suddenly engage in cyber attacks against Taiwan, and among NATO allies and allies in Asia, everyone is concerned about that potential scenario in the coming years, that Starlink would not be made available for Taiwan because of the level of risk that Elon Musk would be taking with Tesla having China as its most important existing and future market. I find this utterly fascinating. Not just fascinating because of the role of technology in the military and national security sphere, but increasingly the role of digital technology in every sphere. The same company, Twitter, that Elon Musk now owns, before he bought it, made an individual decision to deplatform the sitting president of the United States. Facebook made the same decision. His ability to, in real time, provide information, true or untrue, to hundreds of millions of Americans and others all over the world, suddenly shut off, not by a government, but by two individuals running technology companies. I think if it wasn't for Twitter and Facebook, I don't believe that Trump would have been elected president. I don't think Bolsonaro would have won in Brazil. I don't think AMLO would have won in Mexico. I think the ability of individual anti-establishment leaders to leverage direct communications to the public and build massive constituencies are facilitated by these platforms. But they can also be removed by these platforms. Again, some of you in the audience today will be very favorably disposed towards the decisions that have been made by these individuals. Some of you will not. The important point is that they're the ones making the decisions. While historically, when we talk about geopolitical power, we would be talking overwhelmingly about government actors. We just had the G20 summit in Delhi. India was chairing. The Africa Union was brought in. It's now the G21, though the Russians and Chinese at the head of state level didn't show up, so maybe it's the G19. But the G refers to governments. And when we talk about the future of the geopolitical order, we do mostly talk about governments. Will it be a China century? Will the Pax Americana come back? Is the UK relevant post-Brexit? What's the role of the EU? Who's going to sit on the Security Council? All of these things are in flux, in part because global institutions no longer reflect adequately the balance of power in the world. And that balance of power is shifting to different countries, yes. But in the digital world, that balance of power has shifted to technology companies. And that is a game changer, because we don't have yet international institutions or architecture that have these technology companies and leaders as members. Who governs the tech companies? Who determines what kind of algorithms they have, how they will deploy them, how they will affect human beings whose behaviors are intermediated by those algorithms, the countries that will or won't be able to effectively defend themselves on the basis of these algorithms? Who governs that? And the answer right now is the tech companies themselves. Now, the most important transformation in this space is the AI transformation. Because if technology companies act as sovereigns in the digital world, but the digital world doesn't matter that much then who cares? I mean, they run the internet. That determines where people get their information. But if AI increasingly drives and determines winners and losers in the global economy, determines winners and losers in national security, determines whether or not democracies and authoritarian regimes are capable of functioning, and even determines our existence as human beings, not just nature, not just nurture, but algorithm, how we and our children identify ourselves, engage with others. Well, then, these technology companies are becoming fundamentally critical actors in the geopolitical environment. And we have to think about architecture that will include those tech companies. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying this to scare people. I am an enthusiast about artificial intelligence. I believe that AI will drive a new globalization. There are lots of questions, lots of articles in the world today about, is globalization over? Is it fragmenting? Is it dead? After all, the Americans for decades with allies were driving globalization, increasingly open markets, allowing people and ideas and goods and services and capital to move faster and faster across international borders and inside countries for unprecedented productivity. We had 50 years of staggering human growth. If you've read Hans Rosling, the Swedish demographer who sadly recently passed, his book Factfulness, but I highly recommend it to you, or you go on Our World in Data that's come out of Oxford, which I highly recommend, and you just look at the basic data of the billions of people on the planet. We all know the increase in life expectancies. We all know the reduction of infant mortality, the improvement of education, the engagement of women on the planet, the urbanization. We all know the increase of wealth, the growth of a global middle class, the reduction of extreme poverty. 50 years, an incredible moment for the small group of humans on this little ball. At the same time, globalization had negative externalities. We're dealing with a lot of those today. The biggest and most obvious is climate change. Another is the fact that in most advanced industrial democracies, large numbers of people were displaced by free trade and automation, and they got angry. And they felt that globalism, promoted by their governments, did not equate to them benefiting from globalization. And today, they largely oppose it. Oppose their governments, oppose the legitimacy of their systems, oppose free trade, oppose the idea that these countries should act as somehow referees or arbiters or policemen for the world. In other words, for 50 years, a lot of the gains were privatized, but the costs were socialized. I believe AI is going to make that process happen again in 10 years, not 50. In other words, we're going to have extraordinary ramp up of a new globalization 2.0. This is not fundamentally a technology war between the Americans and Chinese. It feels that way when you watch the news today, when you see the talk of de-risking and decoupling, or the export controls on semiconductors, or read the news on Taiwan. But the bigger story is that anyone in the world with a smartphone, no matter what country you're from, is going to have access to these extraordinary tools that will allow them not just to search for information, but to create action, to have access to world-changing education and medicine and leadership and all sorts of other capabilities that will expand human capital, that will speed up, once again, the expansion of a global middle class. I'm excited about that. But I'm not going to spend more time talking about it, because most of the people that you are meeting at CogX are in that field. They are heavily resourced. They are really smart. They're very competitive. They know if they don't build this fast, someone else is breathing down their neck that's prepared to take it over. In other words, I don't think we need political intervention at this point to help ensure that we get globalization 2.0. I think the tech and the money and the leadership is already there in the private sector. That's going to happen. What I worry about are the negative externalities. I worry about the equivalent of displacement and climate change that came from globalization 1.0 coming from globalization 2.0. And this time around, governments not having yet the tools, the resources, the architecture, the institutions to effectively respond. I see 4 big challenges coming on the back of the new globalization. Number 1 is disinformation, and the fact that increasingly human beings will not be able to determine what is created by a bot and what is created by a human. They will engage in conversations online, and they will not know that those conversations are being manipulated by algorithms. You've heard Yuval Harari talk about the idea that when you no longer understand what is true, you no longer have a democracy. This is an existential risk to rule of law and open and free political systems. If you talk to American political officials, they will tell you that the biggest threat to the United States today is not from Russia, it is not from China, it is internal. It is about political instability and disinformation and division that will be turbocharged by AI. With a 2024 national election that will be a political nightmare no matter who wins, the opposition will feel it was fake, it was delegitimized for the first time in American history. We had some of that in 2020 with Trump. This time around, you'll have it with both Democrats and Republicans responding to an outcome that they find fundamentally illegitimate. And AI will make it increasingly hard for any space in the middle to be occupied in a civil society. Then you have proliferation. The fact that larger and larger numbers of corporations and organizations and even individuals will have the ability to use these AI tools not just for productivity, but for dangerous outcomes. I've seen already that there are over 100 human beings on the planet that have the knowledge and the technology to create a new smallpox virus. If any of you are in this room today, don't do that. That clearly is an exponential curve for malware, for spear phishing, for terrorism, that will allow rogue actors not just the North Koreans and the Iranians, but anyone with access to these tools, to create great instability politically. And that's why, for those people that are saying what we need in governance for AI is a new arms control regime, I completely disagree. This is not like nuclear weapons that only governments can build, that are complicated and really expensive and can be tracked. Our history with non-proliferation is very strong. Our ability to prevent proliferation of disruptive AI tools is negligible. And that is going to explode. We then have the disruptions that come from AI displacing lots of people with their existing jobs. Now, again, overall, I'm a glass half full guy. I believe that the wealth that's generated by AI will lead to more employment, will lead to more capacity for more people to be engaged in productive labor. But I also think that those are not necessarily the same people with the same skills, and it's going to happen much, much faster than the people that were displaced in globalization 1.0. Who takes care of those people? What happens when that doesn't occur? And when they're angry? And when they are much more willing to break down their existing democratic regimes? And then finally is the replacement risk. The fact that as particularly young people are spending more and more of their time intermediated by their devices, that they are having, we are having, our humanity changed by AI. Who we are and what it means to be human, what it means to be a productive but happy and engaged member of a community who's ensuring that we are taken care of and not productized. The technology companies do not consider that to be their mandate, but we want someone to. The privatization of the gains and the socialization of the costs cannot be at the expense of our national security, cannot be at the expense of rule of law and our political system, and cannot be at the expense of our humanity. So what are we going to do? And a few early ideas of how we need to govern. The first point that I already intimated is that any solution in our increasingly not bipolar, not multipolar, but technopolar world will need to have technology companies and governments working together. I want to be clear. That does not mean that technology companies get to control the outcomes. My concern is that that will happen if we don't bring tech companies in as responsible. In other words, when the Ukraine contact group is meeting and deciding what kind of weapons are coming from whom and where they should be deployed, and are deciding if you're using NATO weapons, we don't want you to use them to attack inside Russia proper. The long-range weapons that have been provided by the French, by the Brits, air-based, and now soon by the United States, the ATACMS, that came because of multilateral discussions with the Ukrainians saying, we're going to give you these weapons, but you can't use them to attack inside Russia. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone here agrees with those decisions. Giving the weapons or not attacking inside Russia. I bet there are people that disagree with all of that. The point is that the technology companies need to be in that group. They need to be having that discussion too. Some transparency, some accountability, some engagement with the governments, and not just on security and Ukraine or Taiwan, but also on how AI algorithms will be used and can be misused. And here, The best analogy I can come up with is our financial markets. We have this big fight right now between the US and China, and to a degree it's becoming a bit of a fight between the G7 and the BRICS. Are we entering a new Cold War? Might that happen? It's possible. It's possible. But the financial markets still work. All of these governments have central banks, and the central banks operate independently from their governments so that they can ensure the financial markets still work. They have monetary tools that they can deploy. Everyone knows if a financial crisis happens, it's bad for the world. Everyone understands a really bad economic recession needs to be responded to. And so you have organizations like the Financial Stability Board and the Bank of International Settlements. And not only do the Americans, the Brits, the Europeans, the Japanese coordinate on that, but even the Chinese, because the Chinese also understand they need to be part of a functional global marketplace. Well, that's great for responding to an economic recession. But how about responding to a geopolitical recession? What happens when there are very serious issues of international instability that come from AI, from an algorithm that is dangerous, that is deployed, and that is being misused, that could undermine a country's national security or its financial markets? I would argue that we need a geotechnology stability board, that we will need the equivalent of chief technology officers, not that are only focused on an individual country's national security, but on the ability of AI to function with stability at a global level. Because everyone will have access to it, like the financial markets. Everyone can benefit from it, like the financial markets. And everyone can be hurt deeply if suddenly it blows up. That, to me, we have macro-prudential regulation in the markets, which helps ensure that you do not regulate so heavily that you destroy the ability of the banks to do their business, but that you have the capacity to respond when there is a challenge. The difference with AI is that the responses and the ability to identify a problem will be overwhelmingly in the capability and the power of the tech companies in the private sector and not in the governments. Now, if we had 10 or 20 years to get this right, you could convince me that the governments would be able to develop this largely by themselves and bring the companies in as necessary. But I'll tell you that a year ago, there wasn't a leader in the world that I was talking to that was asking me about AI. Today, they all are. The governments are behind the curve. The UK is about to organize a big AI summit. You've got a Hiroshima process from the G7. The Americans brought 7 AI leaders together for voluntary rules that they're going to follow. Everyone now has the beginnings of a plan. The companies are way ahead. The technology is moving exponentially and a lot faster than Moore's Law. So I don't think we have 10 or 20 years. I think this has to happen now. And happening now means the tech companies and the governments are going to have to work together. And they're going to have to do it globally because everyone globally is going to have access to the tools for good, for a new globalization, for our global prosperity, but also to ensure we still have societies that function and we still are able to exist as the humans that we're sometimes proud of. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for inviting me today to CogX. I hope you found this interesting and thought-provoking and worthwhile, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you all so much.